Hi and welcome to lesson 26, the last lesson in this RHCSA video course. In this lesson you'll learn how to configure VNC. In the first part I want you to understand why you'd want to use it and which elements are involved in its configuration. Then we'll set up a VNC server. That part is followed by an explanation of how to access the VNC server using VNC Viewer. You'll apply these newly acquired skills in an exercise, following which I will summarize the procedure that you've gone through to set up a working VNC environment. And then we'll be all set and this course is over. And that is good because you will be ready for the RHCSA exam. So setting up VNC is a little bit difficult, and that is why I want to start by giving you a generic overview of the big picture. So the idea is that you have a server, and on the server you are running a graphical interface. This graphical interface is provided by X server, and X server is capable of delivering just one local GUI, but it's also the system service that you need to offer VNC interfaces. The thing that you should understand about VNC is that VNC is not taking over a local graphical session. VNC is adding a second graphical session that runs on top of the X server. In order to do that, we have the VNC server process. And then there's a user that is coming in using VNC Viewer via user @host localhost :1. And this user is connecting to SSH. The reason that the user is connecting to SSH is because VNC is insecure and you don't want to fly passwords in clear text over the wire, and that is why the user is establishing an encrypted session with the SSH process. Once the user has authenticated on SSH, a session can be established from SSH to the VNC server, and that is the localhost :1 part that you see here. So the user goes to the VNC server, and next a connection will be established to the VNC server session that is running for that specific user. And that session gives access to the X server. And that makes it possible for the VNC user to work on a full-blown graphical interface on your server, but remotely. And that's a generic idea of setting up VNC.
Setting up a VNC server is not easy. And that is not because it's a difficult procedure, but there are so many tiny little things that need to be tied up together, and that can all go wrong. So let me start by installing the required software. That is Tiger VNC, and we do Tiger VNC server as well. Tiger VNC is the client, Tiger VNC server is a server package. Now, in order to use VNC, we need to specify settings for specific users. So I'm going to add a user that we can use for this purpose with the name VNC user. Okay, it already exists, that's fine with me. We're just going to use it. This user needs a password, and that is because a VNC user is going to establish a shell session, and the shell session needs authentication. Next, we need to create the configuration, and this configuration file is a little bit of a weird method that you need to use to create it. So what we can see here is that we have a VNC server @.service file, and I need to copy it. So a VNC server @.service, and I'm copying it to VNC server @:1.service. We need the backslash because otherwise the colon isn't interpreted the right way. It needs escaping for the shell, and 1 is the number of the first session that I want to give. Do not use session number 0 because it won't work and you cannot start the service if it has session number 0. Next, we need to modify the contents of this VNC server file we just created. Because in this file the VNC user is referred to, and you can see that this placeholder is used instead of the username. So we need to remove the placeholder and replace it with the name of the VNC user we want to be using. And there we go. Now we need to tell systemd that something has changed and new configuration files have been added. And in order to do that, I'm using systemctl daemon reload. So before starting the VNC server session, we also need to set a password for the VNC user. And that can only be done as the user itself. So don't try to do it as root, because you will fail. By the way, you will notice if you read the Red Hat documentation that the Red Hat documentation tells you to do it as root. Do not do that. It doesn't work. And only as the user himself I can use the VNC passwd command. Once the password has been set, the environment for the VNC user has been created and you can start the VNC server. Please take care that you start the right process, which is the colon.1 service. It takes a little while because the environment has to be created, and at this point the VNC server appears to be up and running. And that all looks good. Now we're not quite done, because we also need to open the firewall on the service. Firewalls typically do prevent users from accessing services that are running here, and they don't prevent users from getting outside. So I'm using firewall-cmd permanent add service VNC server. And it's successful, and now I can use firewall cmd reload, and now I can use firewall cmd reload to reload the firewall configuration. And this concludes the part of the setup that I need to do on the VNC server.
Let's just recap all the steps that we've gone through, because it was quite a lot. So first you have used yum to install the VNC software. And next you have created a specific file for the VNC session that you want to offer. You need to do that for every single VNC session that needs to be available. So to do that, we have copied the VNC server @service file to a file with the name VNC server @:1.service. In which 1 is the number of the VNC session that the user is also going to use when he is using VNC Viewer. Do remember that you cannot use session number 0 here. That was possible in previous versions of VNC. It is not possible on Red Hat 7. After copying over this file, you need to open the file and change all occurrences of user in uppercase to the name of the user account that you want to use. And next, become that user, and as that user, use VNC passwd. You really need to do it as a specific user, because that is the only way that the configuration files will be created in the user home directory. So do not try to do this as root. The command won't complain, but it just will not work. You also need to do it before starting the VNC server. So once you've done that, you have gone through the most difficult part of the setup, and you just can do the systemctl commands to enable and start the VNC server. And as the last step, the user can use VNC Viewer via user at remote host localhost :1. And the one in here, make sure that it corresponds to the one that you have used in the name of the VNC server file that you created.
To connect to the VNC server, you need the VNC Viewer utility with the option -via followed by the name of the user you want to connect as. So this user is the user account that is going to be used on the SSH connection to create the SSH tunnel. Next you need to specify the name of the VNC host, which is in this case a local host. It works for testing, but in reality you would rather do it from a remote host. Next you need to specify where to create the session to, so that would be localhost :1. I'm pressing enter. This is SSH. Hitting in SSH, asking for a password, and there we have the VNC authentication dialog. So this dialog is showing me that the VNC session is going to be established. And there we go, a VNC session to my own computer.
So, now that you know all about VNC, let's do the exercise. In the exercise, I would like you to configure a VNC server that makes a session available for user Laura on your computer. If user Laura doesn't exist yet, just create the account. Next, use a VNC viewer to establish a session to the VNC server. And you can establish the session on localhost if you don't have an additional Linux computer available. That means in the ideal configuration you have 2 installations of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. If you don't have 2 installations of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you can run the VNC server software on the computer where you are using the VNC viewer command as well. Just establish the SSH session to localhost and that will also work. You made it to the end of the course. Good job! At this point you have learned about all of the topics needed to take the RHCSA exam. To take the exam itself, you have to register at the Red Hat website www.redhat.com/training. Make sure that you take enough time to practice before taking the exam though, as you'll remember the exam measures real skills. If you need additional resources, there's a couple of resources that I can recommend. First, there is this course's website, www.rhatcertification.com. If there's any additional information that becomes relevant over time, I will make sure to post it on the website. So it's a good idea to have a look to make sure that you've got everything you need. You might also be interested in my book, Red Hat RHCE RHCSA 7 Cert Guide, in which you can read about the topics that were discussed in this course and get some additional experience. And if you like this course, I can recommend my Red Hat RHCE 7 Complete video course. The RHCE certification is what comes next on your path to becoming a completely certified expert in Red Hat Linux. Again, my name is Sander van Vugt and it has been a pleasure having you in this course. I'm wishing you good luck with the exam and I hope to meet you again.